Hey, so I'm not sure if my kids will be a bit embarrassed by this video, but I suppose we've had conversations like this around the dinner table in connection with sexuality. And when Rachel and I were pastoring, we would incorporate sometimes things of sexuality into the message as it would relate to people. So I don't think I'm going too far out. So I was thinking about the subject of being a widower or widow in connection to sexuality. I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about it. And what I'm going to share probably relates to, there's application to all kinds of different areas and stuff. So even if you're not a widower or widow, I would encourage you to just listen. One of the questions that comes up, or I have heard people ask, is how do you deal with your sexuality having been married and not being married any longer? It can be really tough at times, slightly different reasons than somebody who hasn't been married or just single. And the reason for that is I think because even particularly when you're first married, as a guy, sexuality, there is intimacy and it is intimate. But I think you're on a journey, and the sexual experience is about two people coming together, but it could be also about the sexual experience a lot. Um, and I'm not saying that it's selfish or wrong, but I think in youthfulness, as I said, particularly as a guy, though it can apply for women as well, that the actual experience, something that you've looked forward to your life, or that you've, if you followed or lived by the Christian value of abstinence. There are people that I've seen online that talk about, as a Christian, and the awkwardness of being married now, been told you can't, and now you can. I suppose maybe I wasn't as ingrained into that type of culture, because when I got married, it was like, yeehaw. And I know it's different for a woman, and yet to some degree, I know my wife, Rachel, shared in that similar desire. And there is an ebb and flow. If you've been married for any significant amount of time, there's an ebb and flow. Sometimes there's a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, a lot of busyness when kids come. Sometimes there's physical things that go on that can make it less frequent. But I think over the whole of the marriage, I think we had a relatively healthy sexual intimacy life that was both fun and exploratory. And um, I think that over time, what happens, particularly as a man, I think women understand this better, is that while there may be those times where it's just quick, you don't have a lot of time, or you both feel turned on by each other in a moment where, yeah, you don't have a lot of time, or it's just something quick because it's just very passionate. But what happens is if you have a healthy marriage where you guys are like friends, your best friends, and just that awesome privilege to be able to go, man, I get to know this person really deeply, you tend to start to slow things down. And so sexual intercourse is not as much about the experience, though that can still be there, but it becomes more about the intimacy. So as a widower or widow, I think when you've been married long enough that you've began to transition, that it still is the experience and you still have the sexual drive and feelings, but it becomes about the intimacy where you slow down, you take more time, you're more connecting emotionally in all levels. You're actually better for the woman maybe than you were initially, or maybe some guys, they're just, I don't know, but like I think that you start to connect more, and it becomes this thing where you look for it because of the intimacy connection. I think when you've experienced that, and you've experienced that on numerous occasions, you really feel the loss as a widower or a widow. But I'm speaking as a widower, because what you miss is not just because I've had sex and now I can't, or I just want to have that experience, but you miss the intimacy more than you do the experience, that closeness, that sharing, that connection of spirit, soul, and body all at one time in perfect oneness, the way that God created it to be, that you experience with this person that you experience with nobody else. And when you're close friends, like I was with my wife, we were close friends before we ever got together. And our friendship just continued to grow, and we had a lot of interests. We did a lot of things together. We ministered together. We homeschool. So you miss that type of intimacy. This applies for people who are single. This applies for people who are married, or in my situation, who were married, or you could be divorced and were married and suddenly not. And how do I maneuver through that? I think that just listening and talking to and knowing who I am as a human being, that keeping sexually pure for one person is not because uh, during marriage is not because of the reasons that you may be solely focused on that individual while you're first dating. They say that infatuation lasts anywhere from 3 minutes to 3 years. And so I think there is a committedness to this other person that is not only in the soul realm, but it's also in the emotional realm, because you're in that stage of infatuation. Your emotions are just consumed with this person. I'm not here to say the emotions leave. I would actually suggest the emotions get stronger as your love goes deeper, but they don't always look or feel the same way. And they're not always as consistent. They're not always like every single minute you're just thinking about this person in a desperate butterflies in the stomach moment. And so people who have experienced it know that a lot of people's sexual intimacy wanes. It's actually interesting. I just throw this in, that we live in such a sexualized culture, that I read somewhere that it used to be around 12 years that this person was a sex therapist, says that dullness had came into the sex life, and that people were coming in for counseling to help rejuvenate. And now, particularly in millennials and younger, who is a very oversexed generation, people who are married couples are now coming at 2 and 3 years regularly looking for help in their sexual relationship. So it just shows, though, that dullness could come in, and the more sexualized we are, the less fulfilled that we are in our actual sex life. And the greatest, I heard a statistic somewhere, the greatest fulfillment that people find, Christian or non-Christian, in sex life is in the context of marriage. So there's just a few little interesting things as to why God said sex should be within marriage, because there's a whole lot of benefits as we walk it with Him and walk it with each other and grow in that mystery. And anybody who's a guy watching this knows your wife is a mystery, and you are constantly having to pursue. If you want to know her, you're constantly having to work at it and put effort into it. But so in the context of marriage, and statistics say there's loads of people, Christian, non-Christian, who are involved in things like porn and things like that. And that temptation is there for all of us. We live in a sexualized society, and so there is these temptations around here for all of us. But there are a lot of people who are married who are stuck in that kind of addiction. So what that shows is that whether you're single, whether you're married, or whether you're a widower or widow, that the temptation is still there. So how do I manage that as a widower is pretty much the same way you handle it as a married person. Or how do you handle it as a single person? Pretty much the same way you would as a married person. Or, it's across the board. It's your relationship with God, your contentment, your knowing in who you are, and really the key, as even particularly as a young person working through some of those sexual struggles and things like that, like knowing that revelation of God's love and forgiveness and righteousness and identity apart from my works of who I am in Him, really helped me deal with a lot and helps me continue to walk through. So I had to walk through as a carer, helping my wife in illness. And there were seasons and times where, especially towards that last year or so, it was a bit more challenging, particularly the last few months, that my life wasn't, my needs were not being fulfilled. And yet I found incredible joy and incredible connection with my wife, with Rachel, still in the context of what it was, what we had, because the friendship and our relationship with God was the basis for that. And I was able to say to my wife, even a few months before she passed, I just says, I want you to know, and she was taking some medications that caused her to bloat and stuff, that I still see you as beautiful to me. I see you as the same person. And I want you to know that I'm not off online trying to fulfill a desire or something, that I'm being faithful. Does it mean that I don't have struggles? Not at all. Does it mean that I'm not a normal human being? Not at all. That I'm not tempted? Not at all. So I don't want to make it sound like this perfect idealistic, but it is that relationship with God and that revelation of his love that I have to keep applying to that area. Now, speaking to widowers and widows, yeah, maybe that does become a big temptation to self-fulfill, as an individual, your sexual desires and your sexual struggles. But I would think, just from what I've experienced to some degree and what I've seen and talked to people, the greater struggle that I would see when people ask, how, yeah, is that you would quickly, because if you had a really close marriage, and that you would, the temptation to quickly get involved in a relationship, or even if you wait a little while to get in a relationship, the tendency to engage very quickly before you're married, or to move things along fairly physically quickly, would be the greater temptation and the greater struggle, because, for the reason that I explained before, sex becomes, in a mature relationship, more about the intimacy than the experience. And so the challenge is, and I've seen it and read about it and watched people of getting into quickly into a relationship, or getting in too quickly, too deep, advancing the relationship faster than it needs to go, or getting involved sexually in the relationship before you're actually remarried. And because you're craving that intimacy, as opposed to just the experience. And so in that place, we have to guard our hearts. And that's why in the Song of Solomon, it's so much about sexuality, but it says 3 times in the book, guard your heart. Don't allow love to be released or expressed or become alive or awakened before it's time. Because before the physical ever happens, it happens in attraction, in love, in the feelings and the infatuation. And that's why I find myself now in a strange situation where all the things that me and Rachel have advised our kids, and talked about them with singleness and waiting and putting God first, seeking forth the kingdom and allowing God in that time. I'm like, in that situation, we're all doing this together. And while I'm not maybe focused, maybe so much at this stage on, remarriage or seeking that out, that's a reality as being a younger widower in my life, that I have to, that I think about and look at as something down the road. And I'm like, I have to model for my kids, how to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and trust that as he sees fit, that he will add to me and add to those desires. I think that's the way that we best handle our sexuality. And a lot of these things root from our view of God. Do we trust him? Do we believe that he loves us and has our best in mind? Do we believe that if we have desires, that he cares about those, that even some of those desires, or a lot of those desires, that if they're godly, that he put there? How do I process that? And really just keeps bringing us back to our relationship with him, our intimacy with him, and processing and walking these things. It's not about pushing down the desires, which I think is where maybe some things have gotten twisted and misunderstood in the church. It's talking to God and relating to God and engaging with God over the desires that are there. I remember before Rachel and I got married, I remember talking, even we were friends before there was any relationship, and she said she didn't grow up where there's a huge Christian culture. She grew up in Ireland, and at that time there wasn't a huge Christian population culture, and particularly in spirit-filled spheres, and talking about all these things. I didn't realize God was interested in my dating life or who I was in a relationship with. She said, I just thought it was something I had to figure out on my own. But even with all the teaching and all that's available, how much do we still act? I mean, I've pastored, I've worked with people, disciple, and watched people who seem to just love God and then suddenly go, I'm 30, I'm single, I've never been married, I'm just going to go out and figure this out myself. And how many people, even though they've been taught, um, disengage God from certain areas because of fear. And so I want to encourage you, whatever situation you find yourself in, engage with God, go into intimacy with him, to talk about it, to relate, to hear his heart, share your heart. It's not just, God, you said this, thus I must do it. But God, you said this, and I've got this stuff going on inside of me. How do your life become more alive in me? And how do I grow greater into the things and receive those things that you have for me? And how do I live in the meantime? And so I just want to encourage you with that, as I just be really honest about something that's very much part of who we are. Sexuality is not just something of the flesh that doesn't matter. In fact, the word eros, which is the Greek word for physical love, actually in the original language, one of the definitions is the search for intimacy. And so sometimes Christianity has downplayed it as the least important. It isn't that agape, sacrificial, your life matters to me more than my life, I commit myself to the point of destruction. But it is a reflection of intimacy, to go deeper, to know more, which is something that God wants us to engage with him as well, to know him more. And that's why the same Hebrew word for Adam knew his wife and conceived is the same word where it says in Hosea chapter 6, verse 3, come let us know, come let us pursue the knowledge of God. Because while it's not in that same physical, God wants that experiential knowledge of him. And marriage is, according to Ephesians, is God's greatest gift to us on the earth, that helps model what the church, that intimacy, is meant to look like, and helps prepare our hearts, I believe, in many ways. My marriage, my relationship with Rachel took me to levels in God that I couldn't have done as a single. And so where some people say, Paul said it's better to be single. For me, I grew closer to God and became a better person and a better minister because of Rachel. And if you want to know, how do I know who to marry? I tell people, I got this advice and I found it to be true, that you'll know it's the one because you'll be closer to God with them than you will be without them. And I believe if we start to talk to God and engage and put that kind of attitude in what we're doing, we're going to just see total blessing and transformation. Doesn't mean the journey is going to be easy. Doesn't mean there's not going to be rough days, that you're going to feel lonely, that you're going to be attracted to somebody who you maybe shouldn't be to. Those are all normal things of life that we need to be able to talk about in the church, talk about that these are realities. I tell my kids, you're going to be attracted to people that are not the one for you. That's okay, that's normal. It's what do you do with it? Do you awaken that desire, or do you try to bring that into submission to the will of God and say, God, I know you've got somebody for me. Help me to walk this out. So hope this encourages you, helps you. If you have any questions or thoughts that you want to add into the engagement, put it down in the comments. And just go to God. He loves you. He's got a plan and purpose for your life.